Yes, yes, yes. And today we're really just going to jump right into it because we have a special guest.
Special guest.
Yeah.
I always wish I had the brr, brr, brr. I don't ever have that though. So,
Okay. I thought we were supposed to get like a sound effects board, but that also sounds very cheesy, so we should not.
you know, if sitcoms are still using clap boxes, I mean, we're good. So.
Uh, I don't know. Hollywood. I don't know. But anyways, our special guest today is Dr. Brian Kwoba. Am I pronouncing your last name
Yep.
correct? Okay. Perfect. And he is the author of Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism. If you have not read this book, well, now you have another book to put on your, what are the book lists called these days?
TBRs.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm always thinking of did not read, which is like not what we're trying to talk about here. But this book has gotten some early praise, and I'm going to let Brian introduce himself. But as far as the praise that the book has gotten so far, it's received the 2026 Frantz Fanon Outstanding Book Award from the Caribbean Philosophical Association, the 2026 Phillis Wheatley Book Award from the Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage, and the 2025 Forward Indies finalist for biography. And so, Brian, would love to have you introduce yourself to the listeners, to anybody who's might be watching. I don't know who watches, but feel free to take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Earl and Justin, for having me. Yeah, my name is Brian Kwoba. I am an associate professor of history and also director of African and African American Studies at the University of Memphis. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, and so it's been quite a journey in life because I've traveled all over the place. And now that the book is out, I've been able to tour. Over the past 22 or so years, I've been an activist on a whole range of issues, including anti-imperialism, immigrant workers' rights, climate justice, decolonizing education, Palestine solidarity, and the movement for Black lives, to name a few. And so I share that because I'm coming to this work not just as a scholar, but also as an activist, right? Somebody who has been in countless demonstrations and protests and organizing meetings and marches, much like the subject of my book, Hubert Harrison.
No, that's real cool. That's real cool, and quite the impressive list of activity, as well as sort of being able to spend time in different geographic regions, kind of soaking in different perspectives, cultures, and things like that while there. And I'm sure that goes into your writing style, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But as is customary with our volume series, we like to sort of start by probing questions or definitions at a broader conceptual level before diving into some of the particulars. But of course, it'll be related and relevant. Your book is titled Hubert Harrison, but the subtitle, right, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism, I think contains quite a bit of substance there. And before we can even begin to have the conversation that we hope to have today, and before readers perhaps turn the first page of this book that they will inevitably get because of your appearance here on the Pages Pod, I want to start by asking what the notion of radicalism is in your view, how you see it functioning, maybe in the title, how it informs your own activism. So yeah, maybe I extend this invitation to talk a little bit about what radicalism is. Yeah, and maybe even how we might identify who gets to count as radical based on that view.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, the word radical, I think has sort of been maligned and associated with this idea of somebody being an extremist or sort of a violent and irrational type of political animal. But actually, when you get to the root of radical, what it means to be radical, radical shares, I often mention this to my students, radical shares the same root as radish, which is a root vegetable. Radical means going to the root. If I can use, and I do this in the book on page 2 of my introduction, I share the great civil rights movement mother Ella Baker, the way she defines radical. She says, quote, "In order for us as poor and oppressed people to become part of a society that is meaningful, the system under which we now exist has to be radically changed. This means we're going to learn to have to think in radical terms." I use the term radical in its original meaning, getting down to and understanding the root cause. It means facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you change that system. So Ella Baker was very clear. Radical is about going to the root of the problem. It's about getting beyond the kind of surface level and superficial analyses and strategies that don't actually bring about any kind of systemic or structural or transformative change, but instead just kind of, tinker around the edges. So when I say radical, I mean it in the Ella Baker sense. I mean it in the sense of getting to the root. And Harrison was a radical because he got to the root of so many of the systemic injustices that we still are living with today.
No, I appreciate that. And the sort of image too, thinking about the root. Immediately for me, as we were sort of discussing radical having this relationship to sort of rootedness, it also kind of you talked a little bit about this, is aimed in many ways toward change. And so this distinction between unrooting and replanting or something like that stood out for me. If you'd like to say anything about whether or not there's a distinction between to uproot or to replant, and sort of maybe what Baker saw as like the consequence of radicalism. Is it aimed at a political project, transformative change within that? Is it aimed at the destruction of political projects? You mentioned that radical has become associated with sort of like extremist, word associations. And when we think about extremism, right, I think many people might associate that with destruction and destructiveness, something like an uprooting, maybe without an intention to replant or repot, for example. Perhaps you could speak to that, whether it be through Baker, through Harrison, through your own views on that.
Yeah, well, I part of why I included this word in the title is because, Harrison is one of the figures in the Black radical tradition because he was getting to the root of the systems that produce the inequalities and injustices and sort of, collective traumas that we're still living with. I mean, one example is capitalism. Harrison was not a conservative about capitalism. He wasn't a liberal when it comes to capitalism. He was a radical. He was a socialist. He was calling for the transformation of capitalism, the end of capitalism. Same with imperialism. He was a staunch anti-imperialist, an anti-colonialist. He was quite excited about the anti-colonial movements all across the world, whether we're talking the Easter Rising in Ireland, the struggle of the Indian people against British colonialism, and of course the struggles on the continent of Africa and in the Caribbean, where Harrison was born, the island of St. Croix, where Harrison was born, which is now part of the U.S. Virgin Islands, was taken over by the U.S. military during World War I and placed under U.S. military occupation, much as Haiti had been 2 years prior to World War I, or to the U.S. entry into World War I. And so we could talk about Harrison as a free thinker. Harrison had a whole critique of not just the church and Christianity, but of religion more generally as a kind of force in the world that was colonizing people's minds. As Harrison said, the church and the capitalist class are in league together to dupe and exploit the workers of the world. We could talk about Harrison's radicalism in relation to erotic liberation and sexuality. Harrison was a free lover. As far as I can tell, one of the first Black figures in U.S. history to explicitly and publicly defend free love politics as against the compulsory monogamy that reigned supreme in Harrison's time and still reigns supreme in ours. Harrison was an early voice for calling for decriminalizing access to birth control. Harrison is one of the first Black figures to give a public-facing lecture series on sex education. And he's one of the first to openly and publicly denounce church and state repression of sexuality. So these are some of the ways that I see him as radical in relation to sexuality and monogamy and these kinds of things. So there's a lot of different radicalisms that are combined in a single frame with Harrison, and that's one of the reasons why he's so powerful and why he's so important to study, is because a lot of folks think of themselves as radical, but their radicalism only covers, you know, one or two dimensions, or it might be strong in some areas or weak in others. Yeah. For example, the white left has a history of thinking of itself as radical in relation to class and class struggle, class consciousness. But then when it comes to race, there's often a blind spot, right? Or a weakness when it comes to questions of anti-Black racial oppression, for example. Harrison was for Black liberation. He was a Pan-Africanist, had a deep impact on people like Marcus Garvey, and also on figures like W.E.B. Du Bois in terms of pushing Du Bois to become more radical, right? Yeah. Because Du Bois did not start out thinking about communism and Marxism and things of that nature, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
No, I appreciate you pointing that out too, especially in the wake of so much discussion, newly generated discussion on Du Bois on the back of the PBS documentary. Yep. So I appreciate that, and it's also the way you put a fine point on the many tentacles, if we might call them, of Hubert's radicalism. I can see why it evades such a question as far as like, is it just uprooting? Is it rerooting? I think it's a lot more complex, and I think as you articulated it, Harrison kind of saw it more so. Earl, you want to hop in here?
Yeah, I think that it is remarkable, just like in the sense that I had not been thinking about it before, and also will probably go on to think about it this way now, just as far as radicalism having layers or focuses. I'm like looking for the word. I don't feel satisfied with layers or focuses. But
maybe aims.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, here's the other reason why I think we need to learn from Harrison, which is that no project, however radical it might seem, will actually achieve its own goals if it remains one-dimensional. So, for example, just like a class radical project will never achieve socialism or communism or whatever without incorporating questions of racial oppression, questions of gender and sexuality, and so on. Same with the other side. Like, no matter how radical your quote-unquote race-first politics is, or Black nationalist, or even Black internationalist politics, that's not going to achieve its own goals of Black liberation if it's not also class conscious. If it's not also dealing with questions, of gender and sexuality and some of these other things. And I think a perfect example of where this hasn't been applied enough is in Burkina Faso, right? Because you have an ostensibly anti-imperialist kind of politics in terms of the French and getting French military forces out of Burkina Faso and French bases and stuff. But then the same government turns around and has banned all political parties in the country and has criminalized LGBT people, and is doing these other things that are very backward. Yeah. So it's actually not even going to achieve its own goals in the long run if it continues on that path, because any radical project that wants to win has to integrate and interact and incorporate other frames of reference. Or else those other frames will ultimately be used against it.
Yeah, so in that way, I think radicalism is prismatic. It makes me think about the little kaleidoscope toys that we used to have back in the day, where you would look through them and turning it in different views of the light would, I think, reveal different color spectrums, so on and so forth. So I really, really appreciate that. And as we were prepping things for this episode and to talk with you, I know, Earl, you mentioned that you wanted to talk a little bit about genius as well, as it appears in the title. So maybe we can move a bit from radical or radicalism into thinking.
Yeah, I think genius can be a loaded word, I guess, depending on who you're talking to. But in this context, curious about what does being a genius even mean in your view?
Yeah.
especially in the wake of Kanye. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, well, as you alluded to, Earl, genius is usually coded as white and male and math sci. So Einstein, for example, is the sort of quintessential sort of figure that comes up, I think, when we often hear the word genius. And it's not an accident that he's white and male and sort of in the math and science field. But I think for Black folks especially, genius has always been more of a collective, right? I mean, when you look at the word genius, it shares a root with generative. So genius is about generative force. And, I use the word genius in the title, Forbidden Genius, because in a double sense, right? There's Harrison's individual kind of generative force in terms of being one of the greatest minds that has ever sort of lived and walked on U.S. soil, which many of his contemporaries commented about. He had this kind of insanely high level of sort of intellectual capacity. He had this encyclopedic knowledge about the world. He would read multiple books a day. He could speak for hours on any subject under the sun, everything from ancient African history to the global geopolitics of World War I, to questions of art and culture and sexuality and philosophy and psychology and science and religion and so on. But there's also this collective sense of generative force in Black communities, right? That there's always been this kind of collective and shared and community-based base for the capacities of even our greatest sort of individual figures in history. And so I think the subtitle has a double meaning in that sense, right? There's a forbidden genius of Black radicalism that emerges in individuals, but it also emerges in the Black radical tradition. That itself is a generative force in a collective sense.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's dope. I appreciate the sort of relationship between the individual and the collective there. Also, when you mentioned Einstein, you of course mentioned sort of white and male, and I can't help but be taken by the cover, the photograph or image that you chose for
That's
for
good.
Harrison. Yeah, and I guess I'm wondering, sort of on this male portion, and its association with genius. Has there been any sort of critical commentary, critical feedback, perhaps amongst certain Black feminist factions or things like this around representing or associating Harrison's face with genius? And perhaps maybe this is also an invitation to speak to Harrison's own views on gender, which I read a little bit about in my reading through the book. So.
Yeah, well, first I'll say the cover image of my book is actually not a photograph, but a pencil drawing.
Okay.
It's
Nice. Nice.
it's based on a photograph, but it's actually a pencil drawing by a Zambian artist called Teddy Betchman. And when I saw his work, I was like, man, this guy's amazing. He does these realist, pencil drawings. I want him to do the cover of my book. So after some months of trying to reach out to him, eventually I was able to commission him to do this piece of art for the cover. But in
Yeah,
terms of
kudos
your
to you on
question,
that for sure.
thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. It's like a cool, fun fact because everybody assumes it's a photo when they see it, and then they're like, "Whoa!" Once you realize it's not a photo, it makes you kind of look even closer at
Yeah.
the mastery that Teddy Betchman has demonstrated with his art. But in terms of your question of gender, Harrison had a sort of range of different gender politics, and sometimes they're contradictory. So he was, as I mentioned earlier, he was, supporting erotic liberation. He was calling for decriminalizing access to contraception and defending the idea that we're not monogamists by nature, but by compulsion from the church and the state and capitalism. He worked with a lot of different women in activist settings in the Garvey movement, people like Amy Ashwood Garvey, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn in terms of the socialists and, sort of class radical white left. He campaigned for Eugene Debs. as part of the Socialist Party. He built on the legacy of people like Ida B. Wells, who had forged a real sort of anti-lynching consciousness. And then there's other race women like Eslanda Cardoza Good, for example, the mother of Eslanda Robeson, the wife of Paul Robeson. She worked directly with Harrison in Harrison's Liberty League of Negro Americans, which was the organization that really played a key role in catalyzing the rise of Garvey and Garveyism. And so there's a number of women that Harrison is working with in different settings. And also at the same time, he has a more traditional conception, I think, of gender roles when it came to the family and his own sort of home life. He had a wife and kids. And this is one of the contradictions, right, that emerges. It makes it impossible for him to continue to cohabit with his wife eventually, is that on the one hand, he has a wife and kids, and on the other, he's a free lover. And those two things really couldn't coexist comfortably within his home, because his wife was more traditional and more Christian and sort of more on the sort of mainstream sort of monogamy idea. And so they end up parting ways. Harrison moves out of the house. He continues to co-parent their children, but he can't live, he can't live with his wife at some point. But he never divorces her. He never, disclaims or disowns her. In fact, he continues to love her. And 6 years after he moves out of the house, they have a fifth child, their son William. So clearly they were still in love. Clearly they were still, they still had those feelings. And so, and then the last thing I'll say is there's a little bit of a contradiction in his book, When Africa Awakes, which is like a collection of 50 different essays that Harrison wrote. Only one of those 50-something essays is about Black women. And it's about their beauty, their aesthetic appeal, their attractiveness. It's not about Black women as intellectual innovators or political leaders or anything like that. Even though he knew many Black women and white women who were intellectuals and political leaders and stuff like that. So that's what I mean when I say Harrison had a kind of range of different gender politics, some of them quite radical and progressive, and some a little bit more traditional.
Yeah, no, and that takes me back to that prismatic sort of like understanding of radical and radicalism, and so no, I appreciate you speaking to that. Earl, how does that, I guess, interact with your understanding of genius, actually? Earl, yeah.
You broke up a little bit. You said, how does that...
I was just saying, am I good? Okay, yeah. No, I was just saying, how does that response, I guess, speak to sort of some of the curiosities you had around genius and then sort of like what you were alluding to with gender and things like that?
Yeah, I think that it is kind of on the mark just as far as like what you... or I guess society, quote unquote, I don't know, maybe Western society thinks about when they think of the word genius, right? And so it also is kind of leading me to want to understand like the forbidden part of it too, because in my mind, I'm thinking about like Black radicalism, like the Black part, what is that doing? And also to me that can signify the forbidden part of it. And so, I would love to kind of dig in there.
Yeah, sure. So what I meant, so the reason I chose that word is because most people have never heard of Hubert Harrison. And the reason for that is because even though he was very influential during his lifetime on people like Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois and A. Philip Randolph and folks of that generation, Harrison was more radical than them, and so he was basically written out of the history. And that's why most people have never heard of him. Yeah, there's a real sense in which his legacy was forbidden because the people who had the people who were best, and the individuals and institutions and organizations that were best positioned to preserve Harrison's memory chose not to. And I think part of the reason for that is that he was critical of the Socialist Party even though he made important contributions to it as a black socialist. He becomes critical of Marcus Garvey, even though he made critical contributions to Garvey's rise and the rise of the Garvey movement. And so, he was critical of Du Bois during World War I because Du Bois attempted to become a captain in military intelligence and essentially sold out black folks on the idea that we should close our ranks and forget our grievances during the war. And so the Socialist Party didn't want to remember him. The Garvey movement didn't want to remember him. Du Bois and the NAACP crowd didn't want to remember him. Not to mention his critiques of capitalism and the state and the church, which are also very powerful forces. And so there's all these forces that either had no interest in remembering Harrison or else might have been felt stung by his criticisms of them to the point that they chose not to write him into their history and origin story. And so he's been forbidden by a range of different people for a range of different reasons.
Yeah. And if I may there, I think that, much of what you've had to say, ranging from his criticism of Du Bois and others, the socialist movement, so on and so forth, reminds me of a concept that I'm borrowing from Phillis Blake, who talks about intra-racial antagonism. And you mentioned sort of genius sort of having this relationship both to the individual and to the collective. And it makes me think about this intra-racial antagonism where the collective isn't always this sort of kumbaya type of neatly congealed entity, especially as it pertains to black rights, black politics, views on black liberation, and much of the, I don't know if we want to call it excision or ostracization, I think, of Harrison comes from inside of places that we might expect him to be more revered and taken up. Yeah, I mean, and you spoke a little bit to what that resistance might have been about, but maybe if you could say a little bit more, particularly amongst other black politics emerging at the time.
Sure. Well, we can break it down into some of the different strains of black politics and sort of look at why each of them, didn't want to remember Harrison or couldn't handle his criticism. So if we start with a very mainstream figure like Booker T. Washington, for example, who was famous for founding and directing the Tuskegee Institute, a school of industrial education, for black folks. This is a sort of black conservative politics, right? Tuskegee took money from Rockefeller and Carnegie and some of the robber barons or billionaire oligarchs of Harrison's day, because they wanted institutions like Tuskegee that would produce a class of black folks that would be employable in the industrial economy and just have basically like a trade school level of education and not the higher learning of the Du Boises of the world, for example. Harrison was fired from his job as a postal worker by the Tuskegee machine, which is to say by Washington's monopoly on black politics in the early 20th century. A lieutenant of Washington worked or knew the postmaster in New York, and after Harrison wrote these two editorials criticizing Booker T. Washington and his kind of denial about the realities of racial oppression in the United States, Washington was able to lean on his friend Charles Anderson and get Harrison fired from his job. So there's a clear antagonism there, right? I mentioned Du Bois and the NAACP. Harrison was very critical of the pro-war attitude of Du Bois during World War I, and exposed the fact that Du Bois had attempted to join the government. That was something that I think Du Bois did not appreciate in the moment.
Yeah, it's a bit scandalous,
It is.
Yeah. It's the deep state Du Bois that Du Boisians don't like to talk about very often, and which was absent. Right? They didn't mention him joining the government or attempting to join the government in this recent film that came out. They didn't mention Harrison at all either. But as I always tell them, look, Du Bois would not become more radical after World War I if it wasn't for the Harrisons of the world that called him out on his sellout and his betrayal, right? Du Bois, to his credit, regretted his behavior during World War I for the rest of his life, and increasingly began to embrace Marxism and communism, starting with Black Reconstruction, for example, in the 30s, which is very much a sort of classic text of Black Marxist analysis of African Americans in the Civil War and its aftermath. We could talk about, the Black socialists, like when Harrison founds the Liberty League, which basically helps Marcus Garvey launch a global Garvey movement. To make a long story short, a chapter, I have a whole chapter about this in the book, but to make a long story short, Harrison's Liberty League taught Garvey the politics that he needed in terms of race first, in terms of Black internationalism, in terms of combining Africans and African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans all together in one organization. Right? These are things that Garvey took and used to build the UNIA into a massive global movement that would influence a whole generation of African anti-colonial figures and nationalists, including Malcolm X's parents, right? Both Earl Little and Louise Little were active members of the Garvey movement in Michigan. But then, Harrison, because the Garvey movement gets so large, Garvey ends up tapping Harrison to edit his Negro World newspaper, the Garvey paper, and Harrison's able to see Garvey up close at the UNIA headquarters and Negro World offices, and he develops a critique of Garvey's authoritarian behavior, Garvey's financial misappropriations, Garvey's dreams of a Black empire over which the sun would never set, and because of these criticisms of Marcus Garvey, Harrison becomes a kind of persona non grata for the Garvey movement, right? And so, meanwhile, while he's still in the Garvey movement, he wages a fierce battle with Black socialists because they're saying, "Why are you working with Marcus Garvey? You're part of a sort of Black capitalist enterprise when you're doing that." And Harrison had to defend the politics of race first, based on his own experience in the Socialist Party and the ways that he was trying to get the majority white Socialist Party to take racial oppression more seriously, and getting poo-pooed and getting swept under the rug. And he's like, "You Black socialists are basically Uncle Tom Negroes, like working for the interest of a white political organization as tokens." And so these all these fierce contestations, but with many factions of Black political figures.
Yeah. And of course, hearing that makes me think about, my work is sort of on intimacy, intimate relationships, so on and so forth. And it makes me think about racialized intimacies and this notion of the private, or, the sort of staunch resistance to airing one's dirty laundry out in public. There are supposed to be certain issues that are kept in-house, so on and so forth. And then here you have Harrison kind of going about picking apart, sort of I wouldn't say picking apart, but sort of like amplifying certain contradictions that seem to be sort of already at play. And so, I could imagine why he got so much resistance, but it's also really, really cool that as I was reading in your book, he was also still very well liked amongst people who actually came to know him, right? He seemed like a figure that people enjoyed to be around, like you mentioned earlier, because of his ability to talk at length about so many different topics, so on and so forth. And so, I think that Harrison, I'm learning, and have learned, from you that Harrison comes to sort of represent a lot of contemporary tension that we see within social and or Black social or Black political discourses even today. Which is really, really cool. And I think, again, I opened with a sort of joke about Kanye West in the sense that he calls himself a genius. But when I think about the polarization that Blacks intraracially have around the figure that is Kanye West, and by no means am I intending to compare Hubert Harrison to Kanye West, sort of like on any sort of like political frame, so on and so forth, but just in the sort of sense that to be this, to occupy this stature, right, is to perhaps, stand in the face of intraracial resistance and sort of like ostracization, which is really, really I don't know, something that has just got me thinking about, like we tend to think that when it comes to political figures, pro-black political figures and their agenda, that history wants to remember certain figures as having the entire community behind them, right? And of course that, I think, romanticizes this notion or this narrative around the radical who gets to be a radical, so on and so forth. And I think one of the things that your work is doing is really kind of unearthing, to go back to this notion of the root, to go back to this notion of radicalism. It's really unearthing some of these default assumptions or commitments that we bring with us to conversations about not only radicalism, but just black figures and sort of, how, black figures historically and the narratives that get attached to them. So.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, Harrison, just in case it isn't clear, Harrison was beloved by his community. He lived, most of his adult life in Harlem, and he used to speak on street corners like 135th Street in Lenox to audiences large enough to block traffic, right? Because he had all this knowledge, but he believed that people who had knowledge needed to offer that to the people, and so he would literally speak
He was
outdoors.
like the first open access journal.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I have a whole chapter called The Outdoor Grioversity, which is about, this whole sort of social organism that emerges in Harlem, which Harrison is a pioneer in the art of street corner speaking and what many people called an outdoor university because of the high level of intellectual offerings and engagement that street corner speakers like Harrison were engaged in. I remixed it as a grioversity because I wanted to bring in the West African element, right? The call and response, the figure of the griot, who is the orator, the historian, the wisdom keeper, the poet, the sort of performer, which Harrison in many ways embodies, right? That West African griot-like figure. But yeah, people loved Harrison. They loved his selflessness, with his knowledge, with his understanding. When Harrison died, Reverend Ethelred Brown of the Harlem Community Church, which was a Unitarian Universalist congregation, renamed his church the Hubert Harrison Memorial Church, which is an extremely rare designation for any black figure to achieve and speaks to how respected and how loved he was. The only other example I've been able to think of a church explicitly named for a black American is the John Coltrane Church, the St. John Coltrane Church in San Francisco. And so, so to have, a Hubert Harrison Memorial Church in the 1930s is almost certainly the only church named for a black agnostic who was militantly anti-Christian and anti-religious.
No, that's a cool little tidbit. I mean, and historical factoid. So we talked about radicalism, sort of going to the root, sort of the very root of a lot of these causes. We talked about genus, right, being having its sort of etymological root in genus being generative, right? And then we talked a bit about what it means or meant, or both, to be forbidden, sort of across maybe interracial lines, which I think, Earl, you were getting at with sort of like how kind of blackness functions as a forbidder already, but also in intra-racial context, right, where even amongst folks marked black, as beloved as Harrison was, he got under some people's feathers, and this has contributed to how we've gone about remembering him historically, which is why I think, your book is such an important book. And I want to talk, if we can, a little bit about you, about you as the author of this book, as a scholar, even more broadly. And, in a phone conversation that we had about a couple weeks ago now, you mentioned that this was your first solo authored monograph. Did I have that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and so I'm interested in what motivated you to write this book in particular, right? We only get one first book, so yeah, and you've been getting at it, I think, in talking about the importance you take Harrison to have, but when it comes to actually putting that pen to paper or fingers to keypad to write this book as your first debut book, what was the motivation there? What informed. Yeah, what informs that?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I
Sorry, I was just going to say, I would love for you to also include like how you learned about Harrison in the first place to be motivated to write this book.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I like Harrison. I was in a socialist organization, and one of the things that I learned about while I was in the organization was Harrison. I mean, I read this review of Jeff Perry's first book. Jeff Perry is the first scholar to do any kind of book-length treatment of Harrison. And Perry wrote, he compiled a Hubert Harrison Reader, which is like an annotation of all these primary documents and writings of Harrison. But then he also wrote what became a 2-volume biography of Harrison. So when the first volume came out, I read a review in the Socialist Worker newspaper, which was part of the International Socialist Organization that I was a member of. And I was just blown away because I'd never heard of Hubert Harrison, and yet he was such a fascinating and sort of trailblazing and groundbreaking black socialist. And so that ultimately set me down a path where I ended up getting fired from my job teaching high school for my politics, which is another reason I could relate to Harrison, because Harrison was fired from his postal job for his politics. And that ultimately set me down a path where I decided I wanted to learn more about Harrison. I ended up doing a PhD on Hubert Harrison. And so that's how this book got started. It started out as a PhD dissertation when I was at the University of Oxford back in 2013. And I, over the years, I've revised it, I've rethought things, I've edited, and I also added a whole new chapter when I was a scholar in residence at the Schomburg Center in New York back in 22. So it's been a long journey, it's been a 12-year labor of love to get from, when I started the dissertation to when the book came out. And I'm just really excited to share it because I poured myself into this work. I think, I did right by Harrison, which I'm proud of. And because he's one of these figures
Who is literally watching over your shoulder right now? No,
literally.
I'm kidding.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the thing. I was just going to say, he's one of these figures because I do see this as a work of ancestral reclamation. He's one of these ancestral figures where it's like you got to come correct or don't come at all, And that's part of why it took me so long to get the book out, is because I was really working hard to get it right, and to do justice by Harrison's legacy. And so, yeah, I'm happy to get some book awards and be recognized for the work I've put in. But yeah, I'm really happy to just be connecting with folks and sharing and introducing people to this figure that just has so much to teach us even today, right? And yet has been so thoroughly marginalized in popular awareness.
Definitely sounds like a process, just as far as getting from dissertation to book published and out there. Justin, I know that you're kind of working through your writing process as well, and I have had like a secondhand experience as someone who's not writing a book right now, just like into that process, but curious about any challenges that you encountered while writing this book, especially as like your first one.
And especially with it sort of taking 12 years. I mean, yeah, one of the things you were just mentioning, Earl, with my own writing practice is sort of getting with these large, drawn out projects that do extend over years and trying to sustain the motivation, the passion, the energy that you might have had when you began the project 12 years ago at year 6, at year 9. So yeah, I'm also interested in hearing, about these challenges as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges that I just mentioned was this real feeling that I had of like, okay, I have to get this right. I can't half-ass this on any level, just because of who Hubert Harrison was and what his life and legacy means. It's a tall order to try to do a book-length treatment of such a figure who is just so multidimensional and so has so much depth and so much complexity intellectually. But the other thing is the free love piece, for example, chapter 6, which is called Black Free Love Politics in the Queer New Negro. Harrison, I mentioned him being a sort of trailblazing Black free lover, and that was a challenge for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was a challenge to kind of wrap my mind around Harrison's politics when it comes to his Black free love politics, because he didn't leave behind like transcripts of his talks on the subject. There's one piece of paper in the archive that was 6 lectures on sex from Hubert Harrison in 1917. And what I do in the chapter is basically try to reconstruct what he would have said about some of these things based on that lecture series that he gave, and based on what I knew about the people he was associating with, and sort of their politics, right? And so it was really challenging to reconstruct and rebuild, almost from just scraps in the archive, what Harrison's politics were like on that. But I think I did that well. So the other challenge was, all right, now if I'm going to publish this, like, I actually have to kind of, be a little bit vulnerable as well by talking about something that is so taboo, right? I mean, not only is sex in general a taboo subject, but when you're talking about questioning, compulsory monogamy, right? This sexual regime whereby the only legitimate, quote unquote, respectable number of romantic or sexual partners a person can have is one. That is so deeply ingrained in our society that even when I looked at like books about Black queer sexualities, I saw very little on critiques of non-monogamy or critiques of monogamy. You see critiques of, homo like phobia. You see critiques of heteropatriarchy. You see, there are certain sort of things that we're more comfortable or more familiar criticizing. But monogamy is not one of those things. And so I realized in publishing that chapter, it was going to expose me a little bit in my politics, because to even write the chapter, I had to have enough sort of intellectual range and or life experience, to actually explain his positions, which are very unorthodox. Again, even for people who are working in the mode of Black queer theory or, radical Black feminist politics and those kind of things. And so that was a bit of a challenge. But, Harrison, once again, he kind of led me. He kind of pushed me in different ways. Because at the end of the day, like, I'm actually writing about his politics, not my politics. Certainly I've learned and grown politically from studying Harrison, from walking with him for all these years. But at the end of the day, if I didn't publish the chapter or include that chapter in the book, it would have been like leaving out, I think, a key dimension which no one had ever written about, right? Jeff Perry hadn't written about this. Like, nobody had written about Harrison's free love politics with any depth. And so this was like a chance for me to kind of, revive Harrison's ideas as a way to spark conversations about things that I myself also think are really valuable and important. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, and that was a chapter that I was particularly excited about and delighted to read, per your guidance, directing me there. And I think that, I think there's definitely stuff there that I will be and am presently incorporating into how I think about sort of the relationship between Blackness, monogamy, and non-monogamy in the archive. And so again, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
For sure. If there was, I don't know, I kind of hate these questions as far as like, if there's one thing readers take away. I mean, I think we write the type of things that readers should be taking away more than one thing, obviously. So what are you most hoping that readers, once they encounter this, will be taking away for whatever it's worth? I mean, as authors, as writers, we don't really control how our ideas get taken up, interpreted, put to use, and things like that. But if this is your one chance to control the narrative, so to speak, what are you hoping that readers take away?
Yeah, well, I kind of alluded to it earlier, but I think one of the most important things, I'll answer. I'll begin my response by sharing a quote from Harrison, again, just to kind of bring his voice into this conversation, into the mix. This is a quote from Harrison about education, and he was addressing young people and sort of how they should get education. And he said that their task was to get education, quote, not only in school and college, but in books and newspapers, in marketplaces, institutions, and movements. Prepare by knowing and never think you know until you've listened to 10 others who know differently and have survived the shock, unquote. So that I think is a really kind of Harrisonian idea and methodology, right? That we need to get knowledge, but we can't do that unless we test what we think we know against others who know differently and see if we can survive the shock. Now that's the method that Harrison himself employed, which is why when you start to engage with Harrison, eventually something is going to challenge you. Something might even shock you, right? But there's a deep well of research and study and understanding behind a lot of what Harrison is trying to put out there, right? In his different social movements and different political organizations and street corner, lectures and stuff like that. And so I think the big takeaway from the book is like, we can all do better by testing what we know against others who know differently. So many people, as I alluded to earlier, have a one-dimensional sort of political framework, no matter how radical they are within that, right? So they're super big on, feminism, women's liberation, feminist politics, black feminism, whatever. You have other people who are super into black nationalism, the Garvey, the Malcolm X thing, that's their thing, race first. You have other people who are deep in the Marxist tradition. It's all about, class struggle and class consciousness. And I think, again, like, none of these frameworks can achieve its own stated goals just by itself. It has to be incorporated into other things, unless you want to just end up with, a certain kind of imperialist feminism, for example, right? Or a class unconscious black nationalism that just empowers a new black elite while leaving the masses of black people no better off than before you started. Or the kind of white left class consciousness that doesn't have anything to say about, racial oppression and anti-blackness. Just to give some examples, you know what I mean? Like Harrison, as you said, Harrison had this kaleidoscopic radicalism, as I talk about in the book, many gems in a single frame, right? Mm-hmm. That I think we all can benefit from, that we all can learn from, and frankly, that we're not gonna advance as a progressive movement or as a radical or revolutionary movement. We're not gonna make any progress unless and until we can do better at incorporating and synthesizing other frameworks that may not be the one that's most important to us, but is almost by definition interconnected to whatever it is that we're working on.
No, I appreciate that. And Dr. Brian Kwoba, thank you for giving us the space and opportunity to allow some of our listeners to come to this episode, and test what they know against the thoughts of others. And so, I'm hoping that and knowing that this episode has been, such a generative conversation from the genius of the geniuses, right, himself. And so, I've just been really, really appreciative, and I'm looking forward to seeing how folks engage, not only with what you've had to share with us today, but also with how they continue to engage with the work at a broad scale. Could we maybe let people know where they could find you?
Absolutely, yeah.
And then, of course, we'll link where they could find the book in the show notes and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and thank you both again for having me. This has been a great conversation. I'm always excited to talk about Hubert Harrison and my work and my book and stuff like that. If people want to check out the book, you could go to the UNC Press website. That's my publisher, University of North Carolina Press. And there's a discount code if folks want to get 30% off at checkout. You can put in the code 01UNCP30 to save 30%. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Kwoba, that's dr.kwoba. I also have a website, briankwoba.com. That's just my name, briankwoba.com. And yeah, I'm on a book tour, kind of like a rolling book tour. So chances are, wherever you are, if you're in the U.S. especially, I will be coming soon to a venue near you. I hope to get out to California in the fall, and so I'll hopefully be hitting the Bay Area, L.A., and yeah, hopefully some other places as well. So yeah, thanks again for having me, and look forward to continuing the conversation at some point.
For sure. For sure.
Awesome. Thanks for being here.
You're welcome.